My name is Rachel Carter, and I used to believe I had it all figured out. As a worship leader in Minneapolis, I was proud of what we had built, a thriving music ministry that drew people in with its professional production and polished performances. But in the weeks leading up to the 16th of February, 2024, an unshakable unease settled into my heart. Something felt wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. That morning, I woke up before dawn, determined to make it to our 6 a.m. prayer meeting despite the icy roads left behind by an overnight storm. The air outside was biting cold, and the wind howled as I scraped frost off my car's windshield. I remember hesitating for a moment, looking up at the dark sky, but the thought of missing prayer pulled me forward. As I drove, the streets were eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that sets you on edge. I gripped the wheel tightly, focusing on the road ahead, when I noticed a glimmer of headlights in my rearview mirror. Seconds later, everything shifted. A semi-truck jackknifed across the road ahead of me, its massive frame skidding uncontrollably on the ice. Time seemed to slow as the truck careened toward my car. There was no time to brace for impact. The last thing I remember was the deafening sound of metal crumpling, glass shattering, and then silence. When I opened my eyesore, at least, it felt like I wasn't in my car anymore. I was floating above the wreckage, looking down at the mangled remains of my vehicle. Paramedics were working frantically to free my body, their voices muffled as if coming from underwater. I saw one of them, a young woman with bright red hair, shouting orders. "We're losing her," she cried, but strangely, I felt no fear. Instead, a profound peace enveloped me, a peace so deep it felt as if it were carrying me away from everything I had ever known. And then I saw the light. The light wasn't blinding or harsh, but warm, alive, and inviting. It pulsed gently, radiating an overwhelming sense of love and purpose. I felt myself being drawn toward it, though I had no control over my movement. It was as if the light itself was calling me, pulling me into its embrace. As I moved closer, I became aware of a presence beside me. Turning my head, I found myself face to face with Jesus. Words fail to describe him. His eyes, deep and eternal, seemed to hold galaxies within them, yet they were filled with a love so personal that it felt like it was meant only for me. His smile was both comforting and piercing, a reminder that I was fully known of every thought, every failure, and still fully loved. "Rachel," he said, his voice resonating not just in my ears but in my very soul. It was the kind of voice that didn't merely speak to you, it changed you. Tears sprang to my eyes as I realized where I was and who stood before me. "Lord," I whispered, overwhelmed by his presence, "is this real?" "It is," he answered gently. "I've brought you here because it here is something you need to see. Your heart has been burdened for weeks, hasn't it?" I nodded, recalling the unease I had felt during our worship services, the gnawing sense that something was missing. "Come," he said, extending his hand. "I want to show you the truth about worship in my church." As soon as I took his hand, the scenery around us shifted. We were no longer in the glowing expanse of light, but standing in what I can only describe as a vast observation room. Before us, countless windows displayed scenes of worship services happening all over the world. It was as though time and space no longer held any meaning. "Watch," Jesus said, his tone serious yet compassionate. "You've been feeling the weight of something you couldn't understand. Now I will reveal it to you." I looked at the scenes unfolding before me, unaware that what I was about to witness would change everything I thought I knew, not just about worship, but about myself. As I stood beside Jesus, watching the scenes of worship services unfold before me, I felt both awe and dread. The sheer number of churches displayed in the windows was staggering. Megachurches with thousands of attendees, small country chapels, house gatherings, and everything in between. Yet, this wasn't just a look at their physical reality. Jesus was showing me their spiritual dimension, and what I saw left me speechless. "Look closely," Jesus instructed, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of authority. He directed my attention to a vibrant contemporary worship service. The production was flawless. Colorful lights danced across the room, the sound system filled the space with pristine audio, and the worship team performed with precision and energy. It was the kind of service that would have been praised for its excellence. But then, Jesus allowed me to see beyond the surface. Shadows, dark and insidious, moved through the congregation like smoke. These weren't mere tricks of the light. I recognized them as demonic entities. They slithered between the rows, whispering into the ears of attendees, feeding on pride, distraction, and superficiality. I noticed some worship team members glowing faintly, a sign of genuine devotion, but others had tendrils of darkness wrapped around their spirits, feeding off their egos and performance-driven motives. "My church," Jesus said, his tone filled with sorrow, "has allowed the enemy to infiltrate its worship." I turned to him, feeling the weight of his words. "Lord, is this what's happening in my church too?" He nodded, and in an instant, the scene shifted. I saw my own church's worship service from the previous Sunday. There I was, standing on the stage, leading the congregation in a song about God's glory. But while my lips sang the words, my mind was preoccupied. I was thinking about how the new lighting system looked on camera, whether the live stream was working, and if the harmonies sounded as perfect as they had in rehearsal. I felt shame wash over me as Jesus spoke. "Rachel, do you remember Lucifer's role before his fall?" Before I could answer, I was shown a vision of Lucifer in his heavenly form. He was magnificent, a being created to lead worship in the presence of God. Music flowed through him effortlessly, a natural extension of his being. But then, pride crept in. I saw how he began to crave the worship for himself, subtly shifting his focus from glorifying God to glorifying his own beauty and talent. "The enemy understands the power of worship better than most of my children do," Jesus explained. "He cannot stop it, so he works to distort it, shifting its focus ever so slightly, from me to human elements." I watched as worship team members in various churches became consumed by technical perfection, their hearts disconnected from the presence of God. I saw congregations stirred emotionally but left unchanged spiritually. Song selections were driven by trends, not truth. It was a sobering realization. We had traded intimacy with God for production and performance. "Rachel," Jesus said, his voice soft yet firm, "I need you to see how worship can be restored." Jesus guided me to a new scene, one that stood in stark contrast to what I had just witnessed. On one side, I saw a massive church with a state-of-the-art production setup. The sanctuary was packed with people, and the worship service was an impressive spectacle. Lights flashed in rhythm with the music, and every note was executed flawlessly. But as I looked closer through the spiritual lens Jesus provided, the cracks beneath the surface became evident. Shadows, similar to those I had seen earlier, moved freely among the congregation. Many of the worshipers were passive, their spirits dormant as they watched the performance unfold. A few were engaged, their spirits glowing faintly, but the majority were merely spectators. The worship team appeared more focused on their own execution than on leading others into God's presence. "This is the kind of worship the enemy distorts most easily," Jesus explained. "It looks polished, but it lacks substance. Production and perfection have taken priority over presence." I turned to him, the weight of what I was seeing pressing down on me. "Lord, is there anywhere it hasn't been tainted?" With a gentle motion of his hand, Jesus directed my attention to another window. This time, I saw a small church with simple wooden pews and an old, crackling sound system. The congregation was modest, and their worship was free from elaborate productions or perfectly rehearsed transitions. But what I saw in the spiritual realm was breathtaking. Their worship ascended like a pillar of light, strong and unbroken, reaching the heavens. Angels were present among them, joining in their praise. Every voice, no matter how off-key or unpolished, carried a weight of sincerity that was impossible to ignore. "What's the difference?" I asked, already sensing the answer. "Preparation," Jesus said simply. "They spent more time in prayer than in rehearsal. Their hearts were aligned with my word, and their focus was on me, not themselves." The contrast was undeniable. One service stirred emotions but left spirits empty. The other brought transformation, healing, and the undeniable presence of God. I couldn't help but wonder, how had we let it come to this? And more importantly, how could we return to what was true? Jesus stood silently for a moment, his gaze steady as he surveyed the scenes before us. Then, with a voice full of both authority and compassion, he began to outline the way forward, a path to restore worship to its original, pure purpose. "Rachel," he said, "worship isn't about perfection or production. It's about connection, and it starts with the heart." With a wave of his hand, the scenes shifted again. I saw a worship team gathered in a small room, their instruments resting against the walls as they knelt together in prayer. Their voices rose in unity, not in rehearsed harmonies but in heartfelt cries to God. Some were weeping, others were silently meditating, but all were focused on seeking God's presence before stepping onto the platform. "This," Jesus said, "is where true worship begins. My leaders must first be intercessors, standing in the gap between heaven and earth. Without prayer, worship becomes hollow." The vision shifted again, and I saw another group of worship leaders studying the Bible together. They weren't just reading, they were discussing, questioning, and applying the truths of Scripture to their ministry. Their song choices were born out of this time in the Word, carefully selected to reflect God's character and draw people closer to Him. "Biblical grounding is essential," Jesus continued. "Too many songs today reflect a shallow understanding of who I am. Worship must exalt me, not the worshiper. It must be rooted in truth, not just emotion." I thought of the many planning meetings I'd attended, where songs were chosen based on their popularity or their potential to go viral. Shame burned within me as I realized how often I had prioritized trendiness over theological depth. Jesus wasn't finished. He showed me a worship service where technical elements, lighting, sound, and visuals were used wisely, enhancing the atmosphere without overshadowing the Spirit's movement. The operators of the equipment were prayerful and sensitive, ready to adjust or step back if God's presence moved in an unexpected way. "These tools aren't inherently wrong," Jesus explained, "but they must serve worship, not dictate it. When my Spirit moves, there must be room to follow." The next vision was of a congregation fully engaged in worship. Hands were raised, tears flowed, and voices blended in a raw, unfiltered sound that filled the room. There was no passive observation, no focus on production-only hearts connecting with God. Miracles unfolded. A woman fell to her knees, chains of addiction visibly breaking from her spirit. A man stood, his face radiant, freed from years of bitterness. "This is the power of true worship," Jesus said, his voice filled with passion. "It breaks chains, heals wounds, and ushers in my presence, but it can only happen when worship is offered in spirit and truth." Finally, Jesus turned to me. "Rachel, I am calling my church back to me. The path is simple but requires sacrifice, prayer, humility, truth, and surrender. Will you share what I've shown you?" Tears streamed down my face as I nodded. "Yes, Lord, I'll do whatever it takes." The light began to fade, and I felt a sudden pull, as though I was being drawn back to my body. Jesus smiled, his eyes filled with love and urgency. "Remember everything you've seen," he said. "Share it with my people. Help them return to me." With those final words, I gasped awake, my lungs burning as air filled them. Blinking against the harsh glare of emergency vehicle lights, I found myself surrounded by paramedics. The red-haired woman I had seen earlier leaned over me, relief evident on her face. "Welcome back," she said softly, her voice tinged with amazement. The reality of what had just happened settled over me like a heavy yet holy weight. My car was destroyed, but I had survived without a single. The doctors would later call my recovery miraculous, but I knew the truth. God had spared. Returning to my church, I was a woman transformed. The first thing I did was call a meeting with my worship team. I shared everything I had seen, every revelation. Some were moved to tears, others were silent, absorbing the weight. We began to change. We prayed together before every rehearsal, diving into scripture and seeking God's guidance. We simplified our services, focusing on creating space for God's presence rather than a perfect production. At first, it was uncomfortable both for the team but soon, we began to see lives were being transformed. Healings and breakthroughs happened spontaneously during worship. The focus shifted from us to Him, and His presence filled the room in ways we had never experienced. Jesus had called me to help restore pure worship, and now, I was walking that mission.